Hello, and welcome back to Open 2.0. I'm host Alyssa Cologne, and hope you're all staying safe and healthy during this time. On this edition of Open 2.0, we will discuss an important and difficult subject, child abuse. The Zero Abuse Project is an organization based in Virginia that works towards zero child abuse. Here to talk with us is Robert Peters, senior attorney for the Zero Abuse Project. Welcome to the show, Robert. Now, for my first question, can you talk to us about being a senior attorney and what that entails?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do a lot of training and technical assistance for prosecutors and other multidisciplinary team members, such as investigators, forensic interviewers, upon occasion, SANE nurses who serve abused and neglected children. So I train them in best practices and some practical tips on how to do their jobs better and serve children effectively.
What is your history working with children and families, and how is that like? And why has this work been so important to you?
Yeah, so I'm a former prosecutor, and I dealt primarily with child abuse cases, whether that was prosecuting adult offenders or working with juvenile offenders to ensure they got the treatment they need, or in custody context where unfortunately parental rights had to be terminated based on what was done to children or the children's needs. So I saw a lot of it. I saw how it impacted children, and it mattered to me a great deal because, as we know, trauma potentially can lead to lifelong consequences. You know, there's the phrase "a footprint in wet cement." Trauma can leave an imprint on a life, and it can affect you in ways that you don't even understand are related to that trauma until many years later, if ever. So a lot of what we see in society with substance abuse, even with medical conditions like cancer or obesity, those are often linked to underlying childhood trauma. So it's important from that sense because it matters and it affects people's lives. It's also important because when there's communal support for a child, then that can be something that helps them build resilience. So when the justice system does the right thing, when they take abuse seriously, and when they ensure that a child is protected and validated and supported, that can be a source of tremendous ongoing strength and resilience for a child. So that's something that was greatly rewarding about my work and why it mattered. I received one of the most precious gifts I ever had was from a victim of horrific abuse. And she's just a young girl, but she wrote me a letter saying, "Thank you for winning." That was a serious adult sexual abuse case. She said, "Thank you for winning, but it wouldn't have mattered whether you won or not. Thank you, essentially, thank you for fighting for me." And so I think that's what a lot of these kids are looking for. It's not necessarily the outcome, although the outcome is really important. What matters is that someone's in their corner fighting for them. And so that's something that was important about that position I was privileged to have, but it's also a reason why larger systemic response is really important. How communities support children, um, how institutions support children, schools, churches, other faith-based organizations.
Wow. And my next question is, can you help us define abuse and child abuse for youth?
Yeah, so there are legal definitions for abuse that certainly vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, depending on the nature of abuse. That can be, the force capable of causing injury is a common definition for, say, physical abuse type cases. Obviously, forms of sexual contact, if there's an age gap or a power differential, can be sort of the legal definitions for sexual abuse. There are generally a couple different categories. So there's of course physical abuse, where we're seeing violence. It's certainly violence capable of causing injury. There's sexual abuse where there's an exploitation of some sort of relationship, or some sort of contact, and that can not just be that cannot just be like as we conceive of rape. It can be a bit broader. So even sexual contact over clothing often it constitutes sexual contact. One thing that I think we don't often flag is emotional abuse. You know, a lot of times, the children who suffer from abuse, there's not just one form of abuse. There's in the literature, it's called polyvictimization. The majority of people who are abuse victims are abused in multiple ways. So if you've been physically abused, if you've been struck, you've probably also been emotionally abused in terms of disparaging language. In many cases, there's also been sexual abuse, just sort of negating your dignity in multiple ways. There's a study, I believe, that 66% of abuse victims have experienced multiple forms of abuse. And then to draw a bit of a distinction between abuse and neglect. So abuse says to a victim, you don't matter. It's a disparaging way of treating someone that says they don't matter. And as I said, that comes out in those different ways, be that physical abuse, sexual abuse, or some other way. Neglect says you don't exist. So that's where there's just total lack of provision of food, or shelter, things like that. And I'm not talking about poverty. I'm talking about where there's an ability to provide these resources and it just is not given, period. And so that's something we certainly see a lot in my home jurisdiction of West Virginia, often correlated to the substance abuse crisis, unfortunately. But that's the message that these children receive growing up, that they don't exist because they're never prioritized or even recognized. One other thing I want to throw out is spiritual abuse. That's something I'm particularly passionate about with some of my background, investigating and addressing abuse within various faith communities. And this is something that exists in every faith community. It's not specific to any faith tradition, or denomination or culture. Even it's something that exists everywhere. And a lot of times we see the various traditions or doctrines of a specific faith community leveraged in order for a perpetrator to abuse a child, by sort of claiming some sort of divine right to do so. And that can look different in different cultures, but also they can use religious doctrines to avoid accountability for abuse, you know, saying, oh, you need to forgive and forget and things like that, to give one example, although again, it varies from culture to culture. So that's another form of abuse that can be very devastating because it attacks the child's beliefs and their core beliefs about the world and how the world works, and is there good in the world, and is there sort of a plan to all that, and it really can be another form of trauma that's incredibly damaging. That's something literature is continuing to recognize as well.
What are signs of abuse that youth should be cautious of? I know you mentioned some, but is there any more, like, that we might not realize that is abuse, like tone?
Yeah, I think one of the main things that youth need to be aware of when it comes to signs of abuse is really attempts to isolate them from others. So that's one of the first thing that those who are seeking to exploit others tend to do. They don't want you to have external support, right? They need to be your entire support, because if they're not your entire support, then that makes it a bit harder for them to abuse and exploit. So being very cautious of anyone who would attempt to isolate you, and that can look different. You know, sometimes you see that in unhealthy relationships. That's something to be aware of in that context as well. Someone who is demanding, you know, you not hang out with any other friends, or limits your contact with family. I think that's something to be very aware of, and that can be in-person relationships, just peer relationships at school, but it can also be online relationships. If you have someone who's in those kind of behaviors, exhibiting those kind of behaviors online, that's a huge concern, especially if they're an adult. Another thing to be aware of is what is the focus of people around you. Like, so for example, in online communication, if the goal is just uh, if the goal is just if there's just an emphasis on, like, body parts, for example, getting pictures of body parts, or sending pictures of body parts, if that's all they're focused on versus who you are as a person, that's an indicator that maybe they don't have your best intentions in mind. And again, if they're an adult, that's criminal. But again, that type of emphasis tells you that they're not necessarily interested in who you are as a person. They're just interested in what you can do for them, and so they're seeking to abuse and exploit. I think another thing that can be really important for youth to engage in is being mindful of those dynamics with their friends, because oftentimes, youth are on the front lines. They see things that adults don't see. They see things that often family members don't see. And so being aware, just in your friends, sudden changes in behavior, that's one of the biggest indicators of abuse. If you see someone in your peer group who just is maybe suddenly immediately outgoing, whereas they weren't that way naturally, or vice versa, if they're suddenly withdrawn and there seem to be dynamics of guilt and shame, that can also be an indicator of abuse. I think one of the things that makes abuse difficult to detect is it's normal to be normal. I mean, different people are different, right? And so we respond to things in different ways. Some of us respond with those sudden changes and shifts in behavior, but some of us respond by putting on a good front, putting on a mask, and going on with life as usual. So just because someone who appears to be normal or behaving in a normal way, that doesn't mean there's not abuse. But it just reinforces the importance of checking in with our loved ones and those around us, and just the importance of good communication, certainly peer to peer, but also child to family as well. So those are some things I would point out just in terms of signs. In terms of signs of physical abuse, obviously injuries. And I know this varies a bit depending on the age of it, but when we're talking younger kids, um, older kids, obviously, any form of injury is questionable. When we're talking younger kids, I've got kids, and my kids are pretty young right now. Kids certainly get bruises. Just because a child has a bruise doesn't mean there's physical abuse going on. But where injuries are is really important. So maybe this might be important for kids who babysit potentially, but if you have injuries to, say, the back of the back. So kids are generally frontal explorers. So if there are injuries to the back of the head, that's obviously concerning. Injuries to the back of the torso, back of the legs, all those are probably indicators of abuse in young children, because young children are forward explorers. So they'll fall over, they'll bruise knees, shins, sometimes even foreheads. But rearward facing injuries are extremely concerning. Another thing that's concerning is injuries to soft tissue. So, for example, if there's a bruise to, like, something we call it a bony prominence, a forehead, or things like that, that's not very uncommon. Often not an indicator of abuse. Obviously, if it's more severe, it's certainly things we should check out. But injuries, if you have bruising to, like, soft tissue, that's more concerning and more indicative of abuse.
Thank you for giving us that information, and now we could be aware and see the signs of abuse. My next question is, if youth are confused and have questions about signs of abuse and or concerns, who should they talk to or reach out to?
Definitely. So if children are concerned or have questions about signs of abuse, one thing that we at Zero Abuse Project talk about a lot is having 5 trusted adults. So you need to make a list of 5 people in your life that you can go to about anything. If you have concerns, and they're just trusted individuals that you can speak freely to, without fear of judgment or punishment. And so that can look like different things. It could be relatives, maybe. It could be maybe some other trusted individual, like a teacher, maybe someone in a faith community, or some other community organization. But having those and going ahead and planning out in advance, even if there's not anything that you're struggling with right now, having that existing support network is really important as things come up. So that's the first thing I would say is think of who those 5 trusted adults are in your life. Another thing would be to think of mandated reporters. So many people, because they work with youth, are required by law to report abuse. And so those are people who should have received training on what to do and how to handle those situations. So talking to those individuals, in most states, that includes teachers. Teachers need to know how to handle reports of abuse. So they're individuals who, if they don't know how to help, they can put you in contact with someone who can. Obviously, law enforcement's another potential mandated reporter in some states. Faith communities or anyone who works or volunteers with kids is a mandated reporter. So those are often also some good places to look. One thing I would say, and why it's important to have several, right, at least 5 people you can go to, is that unfortunately, a lot of times when people come forward, they're not believed the first time. And we see that getting better, just with the Me Too movement and things like that. But even then, we've got a long way to go as a society on really appropriately supporting kids and supporting people who've been through abusive situations. So that's why you have 5, right? Because if you go to someone and it's not a great reaction and they're not really helpful, they don't really know what to do, maybe even you feel like they don't really take you seriously, you need to have these other people that you can go to and keep telling until you get to a place where you or a friend can receive the help and support that you need.
Thank you for giving that advice. I know, some youth, like, they may not know how to reach out to or who to talk to in certain situations. So I just want to say thank you for informing us and telling us how to do and how to approach it. My next question is, what is the Zero Abuse Project, and what are the missions and goals of the Zero Abuse Project?
Yeah, so the Zero Abuse Project, it's a nonprofit organization, and it's the vision of the Zero Abuse Project is zero abuse, a world where every child is free from abuse. And so the mission of Zero Abuse Project is to protect kids from abuse and sexual assault by engaging people and resources in a trauma-informed way through education, research, advocacy, and advanced technology. So what that looks like concretely, we do extensive trainings for frontline professionals, including prosecutors, investigators, social workers, forensic interviewers, child advocacy center personnel, you name it. If they're involved in fighting against abuse, we're there to provide training and support and technical assistance for them. Another thing we do is really working to empower families as well. So there's a really great curriculum that Zero Abuse Project developed. It's called the Empower Me curriculum. It deals with online safety issues, body safety issues, and I know several members of our staff have presented that at schools. It's also really helpful stuff for families too. It can be awkward, right, to talk about these issues when we're talking about body safety with kids. It can be just an awkward topic, and so I think one thing that curriculum does really well is explain to parents why it's important and maybe how to have those follow-on discussions with kids and just why it's so important.
Thank you. And could you also elaborate on the programs and resources that you guys offers for families and professionals?
Yeah. So another program that the Zero Abuse Project has is the CAS program, so the Child Advocacy Studies. And this is a curriculum that's been integrated into 81 different institutions around the world, many of which, of course, in the United States. And it really trains students primarily at the undergraduate level in how to really engage in these cases with excellence. So you're not learning on the job how to serve kids. You're learning in school, and you're prepared. You can hit the ground running once you have your degree. So that I think is a really important program of the Zero Abuse Project. One of the programs that Zero Abuse has is the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center, and it provides assistance to families in missing children cases. And so families of if a child has run away or kidnapped or things like that, they'll provide assistance to families in interacting with law enforcement, and just providing tips and resources and support, and obviously some social media presence as well, to step alongside them, and until that child's recovered and walking with them. So that's a really critical program as well. And then I think I mentioned the Empower Me body safety and online safety curriculum. There are a variety of books that they've created. Allison Fay, the director of the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center, has written some books books on abuse prevention for kids, and it's very child friendly. There's storybooks that parents can go through with their kids. Another thing that Zero Abuse Project contributed to is a joint project with Shield Task Force, which is based in West Virginia. It's a small nonprofit, and they partnered to create a series of videos, a personal and digital wellness suite of videos that are for youth that talk through just anxiety issues during the pandemic, during COVID-19, just some basic coping mechanisms and to help you just process that. It also includes a ton of great information on staying safe online and some information on body safety and things to be aware of to keep you safe, but also to keep your friends safe. And so those we're really excited by that project and those videos, and those are available online as well.
How has the pandemic affected the Zero Abuse Project, and how have the mission and goals of the Zero Abuse Project deepened since the pandemic?
Yeah. So, like the rest of the nation, obviously, we've been impacted from a travel standpoint. So, we have an excellent staff of great trainers who travel across the nation all year. Some people, it seems, on a weekly basis. That we have some very hardworking professionals on our Zero Abuse Project team, and so certainly we've been impacted to some extent just with the travel issues. But with that said, what we've been able to do is pivot to virtual training. And so now we've been able to present to hundreds, well, actually thousands of professionals just since the pandemic, just through virtual platforms. So we've transitioned a ton of our trainings just to online, and we've been able to reach a broader audience that way. I think another way that the pandemic has affected us is it sort of forces some innovation, right? It forces you to rethink some processes and maybe become a bit more efficient. So I think that's another great thing to come out of it. Another thing we've been doing that certainly comes from the pandemic is we put out two publications for frontline professionals and one of them more towards the broader public as well on how to fight child abuse during a pandemic. So one of those is called Responding to Child Abuse During a Pandemic: 25 Tips for Multidisciplinary Teams, and that covers the importance of getting good information to mandatory reporters. It talks about how the front lines of child abuse detection have shifted, right? Historically, schools and school personnel, they're the ones who have detected a huge chunk of abuse, if not the majority of abuse. According to one study by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, 52% of child abuse cases were identified by schools and school personnel. There are other stats that say it's a bit less, but regardless, it's a lot, right? And now, with less exposure to schools and mandated reporters at schools and faith communities, the front lines of detection have shifted. You know, in my jurisdiction, there's a bunch of food distribution efforts. You've got community organizations and faith-based communities and restaurants that are going around delivering meals to kids, oftentimes through the school systems as well. Those people are now on the front lines of detecting child abuse. And so, how do we know what to look for, and how do we educate those broader front lines? That's what that article is talking about. Another publication we put out is Conducting and Defending a Forensic Interview or a Pandemic Era Forensic Interview. So this is talking about when we as professionals sit down with kids and we talk to them about their story, and just we hear from them in their words about what happened. That process is called a forensic interview. It's done in a very careful way, so it's scientifically and legally defensible, and it minimizes the trauma to the child. So we're having this one interview versus a series of interviews. But obviously, with COVID-19, we've got to do that in a different way, right, to ensure the safety of both the child and the child protection personnel. And so, how do we do that in a way that's legally defensible? That's another publication we put out, and that's another effect. In terms of how our mission and goals have deepened since the pandemic, I think in one sense it's reinforced the importance of our mission. Uh, you know, we were concerned about child abuse increasing during a pandemic, and we are concerned about that. And it appears that it is. And one way that we see child abuse increasing during the pandemic is with online exploitation. So online exploitation, children and youth being victimized online, being coerced or lured into sending inappropriate photos, and then maybe being coerced into sending more of them. And then that can be leveraged and go to some really dark places, unfortunately. That has existed, and it's been escalating a lot. For example, in March of 2019, there were almost a million reports made to NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, of online child exploitation. But the pandemic has greatly increased that. If we go to March 2020 of this year, as the shutdowns were happening, that number more than doubled. The reports of online exploitation more than doubled to over 2 million reports in that month alone. So we do believe that child abuse, both online and in person, is increasing during the pandemic. One of the things is, children are isolated now. And I already talked about how they're isolated from mandated reporters. But the reality is, I think a lot of us think of child abuse as something that's scary, that's out there, right? It's we don't think about it being in our schools, in our churches, in our communities, and in our faith communities, but it is 90% of the time. Children are abused by someone they know and someone they love. Typically, it's not some stranger like you see on TV. Typically, it's not a stranger assault. Those do happen, but they're relatively rare. Typically, it's in the family. And right now, children are isolated, often with family members, and so statistically isolated expose them. Now, most people want to keep kids safe. Most adults are safe, but those that aren't are typically very close to the child, and that's why we're so concerned about these issues. That's why it's important for children to be educated, of course, on the signs of abuse, but also how to reach out for help. There's a crisis text line. We include that information at the end of the Shield videos that youth can reach out to if they're concerned. There's also the Child Help hotline. It's a national hotline that they can reach out to as well. Certainly, any sort of imminent danger, certainly can call law enforcement and local CPS hotlines. But it's really important for youth to know the resources and look out for each other. And it's also important for us as adults to not put that responsibility solely on children, right? It's on us to be very vigilant to be very vigilant to ensure the protection of our children and communities.
If families and organizations wanted to get in contact with you and or learn more about the Zero Abuse Project, how can we do that?
Yeah, the best way would be by going to zeroabuseproject.org, and there's contact information there, both phone contact and email contact. That'd be the best way. And certainly, I'm welcome. I can be contacted too. Best way for me is my email address, robert.peters@zeroabuseproject.org. I'm more focused on the frontline professional training. Best way for broader inquiries is by going to zeroabuseproject.org and requesting information there.
Thank you. And now for my last question, do you have any advice or tips or a special message you like to share with the youth and families during this time?
Yeah, I think an important message that children need to hear in this time is you're not alone. This is a very difficult time period, but we are going to get through this. We'll get through this together. We'll get through this as communities and as a nation. And there is help available if you're in a situation that's difficult and you don't know a way out. There are resources available. There are people who want to help you and empower you.
Thank you so much, Robert Peters, for joining us and for giving us more information and resources. And it was great talking with you and learning more about the Zero Abuse Project. Thank you guys for tuning in, and I hope I get to catch you next time on the next Open 2.0. Bye.